Dominic Voss had always believed that home was less a place than a memory. Yet, as he stepped through the towering gates of the Voss estate, the scent of polished wood and faint traces of jasmine in the gardens reminded him that some things never faded. The mansion rose before him, a monumental echo of wealth, lineage, and quiet authority. Its white stone walls gleamed in the morning sun, but even the brightness could not entirely hide the subtle shadows in its corners, shadows that had grown while he was away. He adjusted the cuff of his silk shirt, letting his gaze sweep over the perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything seemed immaculately ordered, almost too precise. The roses were pruned to perfection, the fountains gleamed, and yet there was a small, nagging detail in the corner of his mind. A portrait hung slightly crooked in the grand hall, its gold frame glinting at an odd angle. Dominic frowned, stepping closer. It was the portrait of his father, eyes stern, mouth pressed in the practiced line of aristocracy. But something about it didn't feel right. A tiny crack along the frame caught his attention, subtle yet deliberate. "Everything in order, sir." The voice belonged to the head housekeeper, Mrs. Ellery, who appeared from behind a column with her usual quiet efficiency. She was a woman who carried authority like an invisible crown, and Dominic had long learned that questioning her directly was pointless. "Looks fine," he said, his voice flat. Yet, even as he spoke, he noticed the slight twitch in her left eye, the barely perceptible way her hands clenched the corner of a dusting cloth. Something was off. Mrs. Ellery inclined her head. "Of course, sir. Breakfast will be ready shortly." She glided away, her heels silent on the marble floor, leaving Dominic alone with the echo of his own footsteps. As he wandered further into the mansion, the quiet was almost oppressive. He passed room after room, each immaculate but eerily lifeless. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and candle wax, and he realized that the mansion had been maintained as a museum of itself rather than a home. Yet, in one corner, near the sweeping staircase, he noticed a small movement. A young maid was kneeling, carefully polishing the floorboards. She moved with meticulous precision, her dark hair tucked neatly under a cap, her hands gloved even in the warmth of the morning sun. Dominic paused, observing her. There was something unusual about the way she worked, not the efficiency, but the awareness. Every time he shifted his gaze, she seemed to anticipate it, glancing up only for a moment before returning to her task. He frowned. He had met many of the staff over the years, and none had the quiet, almost unnerving attentiveness of this girl. "Good morning," he said, his tone deliberate. The maid lifted her eyes briefly, bowing her head slightly. "Good morning, sir." Her voice was soft, controlled, polite, but Dominic felt a strange resonance, a familiarity he couldn't place. She didn't smile, didn't hesitate, yet there was a gravity to her presence that made the air between them taut. Dominic continued his inspection, moving past the drawing rooms and lounges into the private study. It was a room he had spent countless hours in as a child, filled with his father's books, journals, and curiosities from around the world. Yet even here, something was off. The shelves were dusted and orderly, but a single volume, an old leather-bound diary, was not in its usual place. He frowned, reaching for it, and that's when he noticed it, a handkerchief, folded neatly and tucked into the spine of the diary. The white cloth was embroidered with fine initials he knew all too well, his late wife's. He blinked, heart skipping a beat. How could something so personal be here, in a room he hadn't entered in years, when the maid had only just passed by? The quiet hum of the mansion seemed to deepen. Dominic's mind raced. The house was full of staff, all seemingly devoted to their duties, yet this handkerchief had appeared in a place it shouldn't be. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "Who placed this here?" he muttered to himself, but no answer came. Only the faint shuffle of movement from the stairway hinted at life elsewhere in the house. He turned back toward the staircase, scanning the grand hall again. The maid was gone. A chill ran down his spine. Had she been there a moment ago? Or had his mind been playing tricks? Something about the way she moved, the precision, the awareness suggested that she was not merely a servant. She was watching. And perhaps, just perhaps, she knew more than she should. Dominic's gaze drifted to the portraits lining the walls, the faces of ancestors long gone. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, accusing and silent. The mansion, in its perfect order, suddenly felt alive with secrets. He realized that every detail he had previously dismissed was a small clue, a whisper of something larger hidden beneath the marble floors and polished wood. A soft sound made him freeze. Footsteps light, careful, almost hesitant echoed from the corridor beyond. Dominic's hand tightened around the handkerchief. The footsteps stopped. Then, a faint clearing of a throat. He turned sharply toward the sound, heart hammering, but the corridor was empty. The only thing visible was the shadow of the staircase railing, stretching across the polished floor. And then, in the reflection of the glossy surface, he saw it, a fleeting figure, moving with deliberate quiet, disappearing around the corner before he could reach them. Dominic's pulse quickened. That fleeting presence, the same careful awareness he had noticed in the maid, was unnervingly familiar. He couldn't place it yet, but the seed of recognition had been planted. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He stepped back into the study, eyes darting across the room. The diary remained, but the handkerchief was gone. His stomach dropped. Someone had taken it. Someone had been in the room with him, someone who shouldn't have been there. The mansion, for all its calm elegance, had shifted. Its polished floors and golden chandeliers no longer promised security. They were masks, hiding movement, watching eyes, and a secret that had just begun to stir. Dominic's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew, with a certainty that made the blood in his veins run cold, that whatever game had begun here, he was already a part of it. And then he realized something even more terrifying. The young maid, the one he had only glimpsed for a moment, she had left a single token behind. Not the handkerchief itself, but a small slip of folded paper, tucked under the edge of the diary. He bent down, hands trembling slightly, and unfolded it. The words written inside were simple, but their meaning was anything but. "You are not ready for this. Watch closely." Dominic swallowed hard, his heart pounded. The mansion was no longer just a homecoming, it was a puzzle, and he had just uncovered the first ominous piece. The calm had ended. Dominic realizes someone knows he's here, someone who has access to even the most private corners of his mansion. The young maid Clara was no ordinary servant. And that handkerchief, that mysterious note, they are only the beginning of a truth he is not ready to face. Dominic sat at the breakfast table, the morning light streaming through the tall windows of the dining hall, gilding the edges of silverware and china. The mansion, for all its grandeur, felt oddly hollow this morning. The quiet from yesterday's inspection had been replaced by a subtle tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The maid Clara, though he still did not know her name, entered with a tray of tea and fresh bread. She moved with a careful grace, placing the items in front of him without a word, her eyes briefly meeting his, acknowledging him without revealing herself. Dominic found himself studying her more intently now. There was a gentleness in her hands, a precision in her movements that suggested intelligence and awareness far beyond her station. "You've been here long?" he asked, breaking the silence. Clara paused, not out of hesitation but calculation. She measured her words, as though the right phrase could protect her, or perhaps him, from something neither of them yet understood. "Some years, sir," she said softly. Her tone was neutral, but Dominic sensed an undercurrent of something deeper, pain, perhaps, or a story untold. He decided to test her further. "And your family?" he asked lightly, though his curiosity was genuine. She shook her head, eyes lowering to the tray. "They are far, sir. I manage." Dominic noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she poured the tea. The vulnerability struck him, not pity, exactly, but concern. He reached across the table, placing a hand gently on hers. "You're doing well," he said quietly, "better than you think." Her eyes flicked up at him, startled. There was a hesitation, a recognition of kindness she had not expected. For a fleeting moment, the carefully maintained mask cracked, revealing the human beneath the girl who had been silently observing everything, calculating every movement. Dominic withdrew his hand, letting the moment linger in the air like a soft note. He did not yet understand why he felt drawn to her, why her presence unsettled him even as it comforted him. Before he could dwell on it, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Ellery, appeared at the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Sir," she said, voice clipped. "The staff has been informed of your schedule today. I trust you will have no trouble? Dominic tilted his head, sensing the subtle undertone of her words. No trouble, he said, though he knew better. There was always trouble here, lurking beneath the polished floors and grand chandeliers. Mrs. Ellery's gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned on her heel and left. The moment she disappeared, Dominic noticed Clara's shoulders tense imperceptibly. Something about the house, about the staff, was far more controlled than it appeared. After breakfast, Dominic wandered toward the library, hoping to lose himself among the familiar scent of books. The mansion had a rhythm, a pattern, and he found comfort in the mundane until he noticed something strange. A small envelope lay on the desk, addressed in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. For him. When the time is right. He frowned. The note was delicate, slightly worn, as if it had been hidden for weeks, perhaps months. Dominic carefully opened it, revealing a single photograph inside. It was a faded picture of a young girl, no older than 10, clutching a stuffed bear. The face was unmistakable Clara's. And yet, something about the background, the clothes, and the timing told him this photo belonged to another life, a life she had never mentioned. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. How could this photo exist in his mansion, in his private study, tied to a girl he barely knew? And why did it feel familiar? His instinct screamed that this was more than coincidence. Dominic? The voice startled him. Clara was at the doorway, hands folded neatly, eyes wide with something he could not yet read. He quickly tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket. Nothing, he said, though the truth would have revealed far too much. She nodded, though her gaze lingered, perceptive and unafraid. There was no fear, only quiet calculation, an acknowledgement that both of them had begun a dangerous game without yet understanding the rules. Later that afternoon, Dominic received a visitor, his old friend and business associate, Victor Haynes. Victor was everything Dominic was not: smooth, charming, and able to wield authority with subtle cruelty. Dominic, Victor said warmly, clapping him on the shoulder. Back from the wastelands of Europe, I see. How was the tour of your ancestral estate? Dominic forced a polite smile, hiding the unease he felt. Peaceful, too peaceful, perhaps. Victor's gaze swept the room, and for a brief moment, it landed on Clara, who was quietly dusting the shelves. His lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. She seems diligent, Victor said, though his tone carried a thin edge. Does she know her place? Dominic's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The question, casual as it seemed, carried a venom he could not ignore. Clara's head remained bowed, hands steady, yet Dominic could sense her awareness of the insult. She did not speak, but her presence seemed to assert itself silently, a quiet defiance that Victor seemed to sense and dislike. Victor's smirk widened. Well, we'll see how long that lasts, won't we? He left shortly afterward, leaving a subtle tension in his wake. Dominic could feel the first cracks forming not in the mansion, but in the carefully constructed facades of everyone within it. That evening, Dominic returned to the study, drawn again to the diary and the strange handkerchief incident from the day before. Something compelled him to check the hidden compartments of the desk, the shelves, anything that might yield a clue. His fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound notebook tucked behind a stack of old ledgers. Flipping it open, he found handwriting that made his heart stop, his own mother's. And the entry, dated decades ago, mentioned a child, a secret kept from the world, and a warning to protect her at all costs. Dominic's breath caught. Could Clara, the young maid, so perceptive and careful, be that child? His mind raced, circling possibilities that seemed too impossible to be true. And then he heard it, the soft click of a door, footsteps moving deliberately along the hallway, stopping just outside the study. He was not alone. Someone was watching him again. He looked up, heart pounding. The figure was partially obscured by shadows, but the outline was unmistakable Clara. Her eyes met his for the briefest instant, and in them, he saw a mixture of warning and inevitability. She whispered, barely audible. Some truths can't be ignored, even when you wish they could. Dominic froze. The weight of her words, combined with the photograph, the diary, and the mysteries unfolding, pressed down on him like a storm about to break. The calm of the mansion, the illusion of order, had shattered. And he realized, with chilling certainty, that his life and perhaps the life of the girl he was beginning to care for would never be the same again. Dominic now has two impossible clues: the photograph of Clara as a child and the notebook entry from his mother. Someone, Clara herself, is deliberately hinting that he is on the edge of a truth he cannot yet grasp. And the final whispered warning leaves him with a single, terrifying realization. He is being pulled into a secret far bigger than he imagined, and every move he makes is being watched. The mansion had grown colder over the past 2 days, though the weather outside remained deceptively mild. Dominic felt it as he moved from room to room, the polished floors echoing his footsteps like a warning. Each sound seemed amplified, each shadow suspicious. He had begun to notice things he might have dismissed before: a misplaced book, a slightly ajar window, the faint scent of someone else's perfume lingering in the hall. Clara, the young maid, appeared throughout the day with uncanny timing. She was never obtrusive, never intrusive, but always present in the periphery, moving through corridors, cleaning, observing. Dominic could not tell whether she was helping him or testing him, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. After breakfast, Dominic returned to the private study, determined to make sense of the photograph and his mother's old notebook. But the room held only more questions. The photograph, once clear and distinct, now seemed almost ominous. The girl in the image, Clara, smiled, innocent and unaware of the life that would follow her. The notebook's warning pulsed in his mind: protect her at all costs. He was not alone. A subtle presence lingered behind him, something he had begun to sense but could not see directly. He spun around, catching only a shadow that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Dominic's sense of unease was interrupted by the arrival of Victor Haynes. Victor had been gone since their tense breakfast encounter, but now he appeared in the study doorway, arms crossed, his smirk deliberate and calculated. "Ah, Dominic," Victor said smoothly. "Deep in thought, I see. Or are you trying to solve the mysteries of your little household?" Dominic's jaw tightened. "Just reviewing some family documents." Victor's eyes flicked to the diary and notebook. He raised an eyebrow. "Curious what the old folks left behind, isn't it? Memories, warnings, secrets. You'd think with all this wealth and power, some things could remain buried." The comment carried more than casual observation. There was a hint of menace in it, subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that Victor was watching Dominic, probing him. It was not outright confrontation, but the edge of it cut deep, a quiet intimidation. Dominic straightened. "Everything in this house is exactly as it should be. I assure you, Victor, I can handle what I find." Victor smirked. "Of course, we'll see about that." He left the room, the soft click of the door echoing like a threat. Dominic felt a surge of urgency. He realized that his investigation, his quiet, careful probing, was no longer just about curiosity. Someone, perhaps many someones, was aware of his every move. And whatever they were guarding, it was important enough to monitor him personally. He took a deep breath and returned to the photograph. Clara's face stared back at him, innocent and unknowing. And yet, he knew now that this was no mere coincidence. Something about her presence in his life, her connection to the photograph, tied directly to the mysteries buried in the mansion and to his own past. Later that afternoon, Dominic wandered into the library, hoping the familiar scent of books might offer clarity. The library, with its towering shelves and dust-laden tomes, had always been a sanctuary. But today, it felt like a trap. Every corner, every aisle seemed alive, hiding movement, waiting. As he ran his fingers along the spines of old volumes, he noticed a slip of paper tucked into one of the ledgers. He pulled it free and read the message, written in hurried, careful handwriting. "Stop asking questions. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." Dominic's heart raced. This was no longer a gentle warning or an accidental clue, it was a deliberate attempt to scare him. Someone wanted him to stop, and the message carried the weight of a veiled threat. He looked around, eyes scanning the library. The sunlight slanting through the high windows cast long, distorted shadows. Every sound, the flutter of pages, the distant hum of the mansion's heating system, seemed amplified. He felt watched, always watched. The clock on the wall, normally a comforting presence marking the orderly passage of time, now felt like a countdown. Something was coming, something urgent, and Dominic could sense the pressure mounting. He had no idea what it was or when it would arrive, only that he was running out of time. Clara appeared silently in the doorway, her presence barely noticeable until he sensed the weight of her gaze. She held a tray of tea, but did not set it down immediately. Instead, she regarded him with something that seemed like concern, though her expression was careful, measured. "You should be careful," she said softly. "Some truths, they aren't meant to be uncovered lightly." Dominic stared at her, chest tightening. Her voice carried more weight than any physical threat, more meaning than the anonymous note. It was as if she knew the danger intimately, as if she had lived it. "Clara." "What do you mean?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. She shook her head, stepping back into the shadows of the doorway. "I can't tell you. Not yet. But, be ready, they are watching, and they will act if you persist." Dominic swallowed hard. Her words confirmed his worst suspicions. The mansion, the photograph, the diary, the notes, everything was part of a web designed to control, manipulate, and intimidate him. And he was now deeply entangled. Determined, he left the library and moved through the mansion, retracing his steps to the private study. The polished floors reflected the long shadows of the evening sun. Everything seemed familiar, yet every step felt like moving through a trap. He reached the study and paused, feeling the tension tighten around him like a vice. Then he noticed something on the desk, a small envelope, identical to the ones he had found before. Hands trembling slightly, he opened it. Inside was a single sentence, typed, cold, and precise. "Stop looking or people get hurt." Dominic's eyes widened. The threat was unmistakable, and he understood immediately that it was not idle. The person who wrote this knew him, knew his habits, and knew his attachments. He looked around the study, heart hammering. Clara's warning, Victor's subtle menace, the notes, the photograph, they all converged into a single, undeniable truth. He was being watched, guided, and warned simultaneously. And then he heard a faint noise behind the bookcase, a whisper of movement, deliberate and silent. Someone was there. Someone was waiting. Dominic's breath caught. He knew instinctively that the next move, whether by him or by the unseen observer, would set events in motion that could not be undone. The clock was ticking, the mansion's walls were closing in, and the game had only just begun. A mysterious stranger emerges from the shadows of the study, a figure Dominic cannot yet identify. Their voice is barely audible, but the words strike with icy precision. "Stop looking, or people get hurt." Dominic realizes that the mansion is no longer just a home, it is a trap, a stage for secrets, and he is now a central player. Every action, every inquiry, carries danger. And the first real threat has made itself known. The mansion never felt smaller, nor more suffocating, than it did that evening. Dominic moved through its long corridors with a sense of foreboding, each polished floorboard echoing his steps like a drumbeat marking time he could not escape. The note on his desk, the final, chilling warning from the shadowed stranger, still burned in his mind. "Stop looking, or people get hurt." He had tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was just a threat designed to scare him into compliance. But every instinct, honed over years of business battles and family intrigue, screamed that the danger was real. Someone inside this house, the people he had trusted, was monitoring him. And the photograph, the diary, Clara's careful glances, Victor's thinly veiled menace, all of it pointed to a truth he had been too afraid to face. Dominic sank into the leather chair in his private study, running a hand over his face. His mind raced. Could he really walk away? Could he ignore the photograph, the mysterious notes, and the unspoken tension in the house, pretending everything was as it appeared? No. He would never be able to ignore it, not when the threads of his own past and the life of the girl who might be more than a servant were tangled in the shadows of his family mansion. Determination replaced hesitation. He had to uncover the truth, and he had to do it carefully. Every detail mattered: the slant of a portrait, the placement of a book, the fleeting expressions of the staff. Every action now carried weight. Every misstep could cost someone dearly. Dominic started with the photograph. He studied it again, tracing the features of the young girl with his eyes. There was something almost impossibly familiar about her smile, the tilt of her head, the way she clutched the stuffed bear. The notebook from his mother's past only intensified the unease. A child, A secret, and warnings to protect these elements were no coincidence. But how could a girl working as a maid, who had been so careful to remain invisible, be tied to his own family in a way he had never imagined? He needed to know, and he needed to act without alerting anyone else in the house. Dominic rose and moved to the library, one of the few rooms where he could think without interruption. Clara had left some moments ago, and the house was quiet, though the silence felt deliberate. He began to search systematically, moving bookshelves, checking drawers, examining ledgers and journals. Hours passed, and the shadows of the evening deepened, stretching across the floor like dark fingers. And then he found it, a hidden compartment in the back of a low shelf, one he had overlooked as a child. Inside was a stack of letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a thin black ribbon. His hands shook slightly as he untied the bundle. The letters were addressed to someone named Eleanor, written in a delicate, familiar hand, his mother's. Each letter spoke of fear, secrecy, and protection. And then, in one envelope, he found a photograph of the same girl from the first picture, slightly older, dressed in clothing that suggested she had lived elsewhere, outside the walls of the mansion. Dominic's mind reeled. Clara the maid, the silent observer, was the child in the photograph. She was connected to his family, and she had been hidden here for reasons he could not yet understand. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a floorboard creaking above him. He froze, listening. The sound was subtle, almost deliberate. Someone was moving through the house, not casually, but carefully, as if they knew he was searching, as if they were tracing his movements. He dropped the letters back into the compartment and moved silently toward the staircase. The mansion's long hallways stretched ahead, and shadows pooled like waiting predators. He reached the landing and paused, heart hammering. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, silent, hands folded in front of her. Dominic stared, unsure whether to be reassured by her presence or wary of her knowledge. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of authority he hadn't noticed before. "They are watching. And now that you've started, it's dangerous." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice," he said firmly. "I can't ignore this, not when so much of my family's past and hers is hidden behind lies." Clara's eyes flickered with an emotion he couldn't place: fear, worry, perhaps sorrow. "I know you don't," she said. "But understand, once you step forward, there is no turning back. They will act if you persist." Dominic nodded, a grim determination settling over him. The calm, ordered world of the mansion had already ended. Whatever forces had been quietly observing him were now aware that he was no longer passive. He was moving deliberately, carefully, into the heart of the secret. And then, a sound made him freeze. A door clicked somewhere behind him, down the corridor he had just left. Not a casual noise, deliberate, measured. Someone was following him. Not openly, not yet, but close enough to make him acutely aware of every step he took. He turned toward the staircase, eyes scanning the shadows, but the hallway was empty. Only the faint hum of the mansion's lights and the distant ticking of the clock remained. Yet the awareness of being watched pressed down on him like a physical weight. Dominic realized, with a chill, that this was the moment of no return. He could not walk away. Not now. Not when the girl Clara, the child hidden in photographs and letters, was connected to his family in ways he was only beginning to understand. Every instinct in his body screamed that danger was imminent. Every shadow, every creak, every soft sound was a potential threat. He had begun a game he could not stop, a path that would lead him into confrontation with forces he could not yet see. He glanced at Clara, standing silently at the top of the stairs. Her expression was unreadable, but he sensed an understanding between them, a shared recognition that the next steps would define everything. Dominic took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and moved forward. The mansion, once a sanctuary of memory and wealth, had become a stage for secrets, threats, and revelations. And he knew now, with absolute certainty, that the house was watching him as much as he was watching it. As he reached for the doorknob to continue his search, a faint shadow moved across the corner of the hallway. He froze, senses heightened. The movement was deliberate, cautious, almost playful, but there was menace in it. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, carried from somewhere behind the walls, faint but clear enough to pierce the silence. "Every step you take, we see." Every question you ask, we know. Stop now, or you will regret it. Dominic's blood ran cold. This was no idle warning. Someone in the mansion, someone skilled, had been observing him from the beginning. They knew his habits, his instincts, and his determination. And now that he had fully stepped into the investigation, he had made himself a target. He looked at Clara, whose calm, unreadable eyes met his. She said nothing, but the weight of her gaze carried an unspoken truth. There was no turning back. Dominic realized, with a sinking certainty, that he had crossed the line. The moment he had feared and perhaps even welcomed had arrived. He was no longer a visitor in his own home. He was a player in a dangerous game, a pawn whose every move was being scrutinized, a seeker of truths that might destroy everything he thought he knew. And then the whisper came again, closer this time, almost behind him. "We warned you. Now, it begins." Dominic has now fully stepped into the investigation. His search for truth has made him a target, and he realizes, the mansion itself is a trap. Someone is actively watching him, and the warnings are no longer abstract, they are immediate and personal. He can no longer turn back, and the danger has officially begun. Dominic had spent days piecing together fragments, chasing shadows through corridors and dusty ledgers, and now he believed he had the truth in his hands. The photograph, the letters, Clara's subtle warnings, all pointed to a secret hidden for decades, one that could explain everything: her presence, the notes, the silent tension of the staff. He returned to the study late in the evening, the mansion quiet around him, the only sound the soft ticking of the antique clock. Dominic laid out the items he had collected across the polished desk: photographs, letters, a notebook with entries he could almost hear in his mother's voice. Each piece of evidence fit together, a puzzle whose final picture he thought he could see. Clara appeared at the doorway, eyes cautious but alert. "Have you found it?" she asked softly. Dominic nodded, a faint smile breaking through the tension he had carried for days. "I believe I have. All the pieces, they make sense now." Her expression flickered, almost imperceptibly, with concern. "Be careful. What you think is truth isn't always what it seems." Dominic dismissed the warning in his mind. He was ready. After all these years of chasing shadows, of hidden glances and whispered threats, he had the evidence, the clarity. He would confront Victor, the man whose subtle intimidation had kept him on edge, and force him to reveal everything. Victor was in the library when Dominic entered, lounging with an air of casual superiority. The soft glow of the lamp highlighted the lines of control etched into his face. He looked up at Dominic, smirk flickering across his features. "You seem pleased with yourself," Victor said smoothly, setting down his glass. "Did you finally solve the little mystery you've been chasing?" Dominic laid out the letters and photographs in front of him. "This ends tonight. I know the truth, Victor. I know what's been hidden, and I know who has been manipulating everything." Victor's smirk widened, though a flicker of something surprise, irritation, perhaps fear passed through his eyes. "Oh. And what exactly is that truth, Dominic?" Dominic leaned forward, voice firm and steady. "Clara isn't just a maid. She's part of my family. My mother hid her here to protect her. You've known this, haven't you? You've been orchestrating the control, the whispers, the intimidation. All of it to keep her secret." Victor paused, tilting his head slightly, as if weighing Dominic's words. Then he laughed, a soft, controlled sound. But there was an edge to it that cut through Dominic's confidence. "You think you understand," Victor said. "You think a few photographs and letters explain decades of careful planning? You have no idea what you're holding, Dominic. You see shadows where there are none, and you call yourself enlightened. That's amusing." Dominic felt a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it aside. He had come too far to retreat now. "Enough games, Victor. I have the evidence. You can deny it all you want, but the truth is here." Victor's smile sharpened. "Ah, yes, the evidence. So fragile, so incomplete." He reached for one of the letters, flipping it in his hands, examining it with mock curiosity. "You didn't read carefully, Dominic. You didn't connect the dots the way I would have. You see, the story you think you know is only one layer of many." Dominic's stomach sank. He realized too late that Victor had anticipated this confrontation, that he had expected Dominic to act on the partial truths he had uncovered. And now, in front of the man who had manipulated the house for decades, Dominic's certainty began to crumble. Victor's voice grew colder. "You've played your hand, Dominic, and I must say, it's entertaining. But you are wrong, completely wrong. And you've made yourself vulnerable in the process." Before Dominic could respond, Victor stood and moved toward the doorway, gesturing with his hand. The staff, previously invisible, emerged from the shadows. Mrs. Ellery, rigid and composed, joined them, along with others who had watched Dominic with polite detachment. "Look around you," Victor said, voice loud, commanding. "You accuse me without understanding. You've overstepped, Dominic. You've made assumptions, and in doing so, you've embarrassed yourself and endangered others." Dominic felt a hot rush of shame and anger. The mansion, which had seemed to hold the key to truth, now felt like a cage. Every glance from the staff, every subtle expression, conveyed judgment. His carefully collected evidence, the very clues he had believed would unravel the mystery, now seemed to mock him. Clara stepped forward, her eyes meeting Dominic's. There was no encouragement in them, only quiet pain. She did not intervene, did not defend him. She had warned him, subtly, repeatedly, but he had ignored the signs. Victor's tone was merciless. "You've been misled, Dominic, not by me, not entirely. But by your own assumptions. You think you are protecting someone, uncovering the truth, and yet you are exposing them to risk, because you cannot see beyond your own arrogance." Dominic's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, to insist that he had been right, but the evidence before him, carefully presented by Victor and observed by the staff, made him feel exposed and foolish. Every word he had spoken, every step he had taken, seemed to have been anticipated and turned against him. And then, Victor leaned close, voice almost a whisper, but with an edge that cut deeper than any public accusation. "You've lost your advantage, Dominic. And when the truth finally comes, it will not be what you expected. Remember this night." The staff shifted, murmuring quietly among themselves. Dominic realized that his only ally, the one person he had believed would share his understanding, was gone. The mansion, silent and imposing, had absorbed his missteps and reflected them back in humiliation. Clara's gaze lingered on him for a brief moment, and Dominic felt a pang of frustration and despair. She had tried to guide him, to warn him, and he had ignored her subtle cues. Now, the consequence was clear. He had overstepped, misjudged, and made himself look foolish in front of everyone. Victor turned and walked away, leaving Dominic standing amid the shadows, surrounded by silent witnesses to his failed confrontation. The mansion, once a repository of clues and hidden truths, now seemed to mock him, its walls reflecting his own errors back at him with cruel precision. Dominic sank into the chair by the desk, feeling the weight of failure press down on him. He had thought he was close to understanding, close to unveiling the secrets that had been kept for decades. But instead, he had been manipulated into a trap, his confidence turned against him, and his credibility shattered. And then he noticed a small detail he had overlooked in the chaos: the slip of paper that Clara had subtly left beneath the edge of the desk earlier that day. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. "This is only the beginning. You have been looking at everything wrong." Dominic's eyes widened. The words confirmed what he feared and hinted at a deeper layer of deception he had yet to comprehend. The false victory, the public humiliation, the apparent failure, none of it was the end. It was a prelude to something far more dangerous. Dominic realizes that everything he believed to be the truth was only a fragment, and that the real story is far more complex and more dangerous. He has lost his only ally, misjudged the antagonist, and now faces the reality that the next move could cost more than his pride, it could cost lives. The game has only just begun, and the stakes are higher than ever. Dominic sat alone in the private study, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a physical force. The mansion, so imposing and precise, felt suffocating. Every polished floorboard, every gilded frame seemed to mock him. He had believed he was on the cusp of uncovering the truth, only to have the evidence he had painstakingly collected twisted, misinterpreted, and weaponized against him. The confrontation with Victor had left him publicly shamed and stripped of credibility. The staff's silent judgment had been palpable. Even Clara, whose subtle guidance had been a lifeline, had retreated into shadows, her silence a bitter reminder of his overconfidence. Dominic rubbed his temples, trying to steady his thoughts. He had underestimated the mansion, underestimated the power of the people who operated within its walls, and underestimated the complexity of the secrets it held. For the first time in years, he felt the crushing weight of helplessness. He sank into the leather chair, staring at the letters and photographs scattered across the desk. The girl Clara was still central to everything, but now her connection to his family seemed shrouded in layers he could not yet penetrate. He felt guilt, frustration, and fear swirl together. What had he exposed by confronting Victor so prematurely? What dangers had he unleashed upon her? As the evening deepened, Dominic leaned back, closing his eyes, and allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. Memories surfaced, memories of his mother, Eleanor, a woman of sharp intelligence and fierce protectiveness. He remembered her warnings, her veiled fears, and the sacrifices she had made to safeguard the family secrets. The letters he had found were pieces of a puzzle he hadn't fully understood. The finally warnings. They spoke of threats, of hidden identities, of children whose safety had to be guarded at all costs. Dominic's chest tightened. He realized that the mystery was not just about power or inheritance, it was personal. It was about protection, love, and loss. His mother had hidden a child for a reason, and now he understood that the stakes were far higher than he had ever imagined. He pushed himself to his feet, pacing the study. The mansion was quiet, but that quiet had become almost unbearable. He couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched, the sense that eyes, unseen but attentive, were tracking his every movement. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the tall windows, seemed amplified in the heavy silence. Determined to regain control, Dominic returned to the hidden compartment he had discovered in the library. He pulled out the letters and photographs once again, examining them with renewed focus. Something had eluded him, some critical detail he had overlooked. And then he saw it, a folded piece of paper, smaller and less conspicuous than the others, tucked into the back of one of the letters. It was almost invisible, a detail meant to be missed. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was delicate, precise, unmistakably his mother's. The message was brief but revelatory. Look at what you have overlooked. The truth is the opposite of what you believe. Dominic's mind raced. The pieces he had assembled, the photograph, the letters, Clara's presence, Victor's manipulation, they were all pointing him in the wrong direction. He had assumed that the clues aligned with his understanding, that uncovering the photograph and the letters would reveal the full story, but now he realized he had misread them entirely. The truth was not what it seemed. Everything he had believed about Clara, about the mansion, about his family's past, might be inverted. The real story was hidden beneath layers of misdirection, carefully constructed over decades. Dominic sank into the chair, gripping the edge of the desk as a wave of frustration and fear washed over him. He had been so close, yet so blind. The false victory, the public humiliation, and Victor's manipulations were all part of a larger, more dangerous game, and he had nearly walked into it without understanding the rules. Clara appeared silently at the doorway, her presence calm but commanding. Dominic looked up, his eyes searching hers for some clue, some guidance. "You found the message," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Now you see why everything seemed to be against you. You were looking in the wrong direction. That's why they allowed you to think you had won." Dominic's chest tightened. "Then, what is the truth?" he asked, voice tense. "What am I missing?" Clara's gaze flickered toward the stack of letters, then back at him. "The child in the photograph, the one you think needs protection, is not the one in danger. The real danger lies elsewhere, and everything you believed about your family's history is inverted." Dominic's mind spun. Inverted, reversed, his thoughts raced through the clues, the letters, the photographs, Victor's smirk, the staff's silent complicity. Could it be that everything he had pursued, the identity of the girl, the connection to the family, was only part of the story, that his assumptions had blinded him to the real truth? He leaned forward, gripping the letters tightly. "Then the real secret, the one my mother wanted protected, it's not what I thought. It's opposite." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. Yes. And now that you understand that, you must act carefully. Every step you take will be watched. Every decision has consequences you cannot yet imagine. Dominic's pulse quickened. He had been searching for truth, but now he realized the danger of knowing only half of it. The mansion, the photograph, the letters, Victor, Clara, all of it was part of a design far larger than he had anticipated. And the key, the piece he had overlooked until now, had flipped everything on its head. He stood abruptly, determination, replacing despair. He could not allow himself to remain paralyzed. The dark hour was only the beginning. Understanding the inversion of the truth was the first step toward reclaiming control. But even as he moved, a chill ran down his spine. The feeling of being watched intensified, the mansion itself seeming alive with hidden eyes and unspoken warnings. Every corridor, every shadow, every flicker of movement could conceal an enemy or a clue. Dominic glanced at Clara, who silently urged him forward. He had reached the lowest point, emotionally and strategically, but he was no longer blind. He had glimpsed the inversion, the hidden layer, and now he could begin to navigate the maze with understanding. And then, the faintest sound reached him, the soft click of a door, almost imperceptible, followed by a whisper carried along the corridor. You have finally seen it, but seeing is only the beginning. Dominic froze. The mansion, once a place of inherited wealth and memory, had become a crucible. He was no longer merely a seeker of truth, he was a player in a dangerous game whose stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Dominic realizes he has been looking at everything the wrong way. The clues, the photograph, the letters, and even Clara's role are all part of a larger inversion of the truth. The real danger and the real secrets have yet to reveal themselves, and he understands that the next steps will require courage, cunning, and trust in the only ally who has guided him subtly all along. Clara. The mansion felt different that morning. The oppressive quiet had lifted slightly, replaced by a taut anticipation. Dominic moved through the halls with a renewed sense of purpose. The revelations from the previous night, the inversion of the truth, the overlooked clue, the understanding that the danger was far deeper than he had imagined had changed everything. Clara met him in the library, her expression calm but resolute. "It's time," she said. "You've seen the truth in part, now you must act. But carefully, they are watching, and their patience is not infinite." Dominic nodded. He had spent days moving like a shadow in the mansion, quietly gathering evidence, piecing together fragments of the past. Now, he knew that subtlety alone would not be enough. He had to confront the orchestrators of the house, to test their reactions, and to force cracks in the facade that had so long concealed the true power within. Their first step was the staff. Dominic had learned through careful observation that not all were loyal to Victor or the household's hidden hierarchy. Some had quietly resented the control, some had glimpsed the injustice in the treatment of Clara and others, and some had been silently waiting for someone brave enough to challenge it. Clara led him through a side corridor to a small parlor, a room he had rarely entered. There, a few of the senior staff waited. Their faces were cautious, guarded, but Dominic sensed their attention. He spoke softly, laying out the situation, not fully revealing the truth, but enough to signal that he was no longer an unwitting player. "I know more than you think," he said. "I know that things have been hidden, manipulated, and controlled for decades. But I also know that some of you want something different. Help me uncover the truth, and I can protect all of you. But if we hesitate, we risk losing everything." A hush fell over the room. Eyes darted, a mixture of fear and relief. Then Mrs. Ellery, the head housekeeper, stepped forward. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of determination. "You finally realized," she said quietly, almost to herself. "About everything." Dominic's pulse quickened. "I've realized enough to know I can't do this alone. But with your help, we can start unraveling the lies and expose those responsible." Other staff members nodded subtly. Small acts of defiance, almost imperceptible, a glance, a shift of weight, a tiny smile. For the first time, Dominic sensed that the household could be his allies rather than his jailers. He and Clara moved next to the core of the mansion's power, Victor. The man had maintained an unshakable facade for decades, controlling information, manipulating perceptions, and orchestrating fear with precision. Dominic knew he could not confront Victor blindly. He needed to provoke a reaction, To test the cracks in that carefully constructed persona, they entered the main hall, where Victor waited, his usual smirk firmly in place. "Ah, Dominic," he said smoothly, "I see you've been busy. Or perhaps you've been wandering in circles, chasing shadows." Dominic stood straight, voice firm. "No shadows remain, Victor. I know more now than you realize. The photograph, the letters, the lies, they're all part of a story you tried to control. And I know you've been manipulating everyone, keeping the truth hidden." Victor's smirk faltered, just slightly. There was a flicker, a shadow passing over his eyes, but he quickly recovered. "Manipulation. Dominic, you mistake careful guidance for manipulation. The house has functioned for decades because of structure, order, and loyalty. You think you are brave, you are reckless." Dominic's eyes swept the room, noting the subtle shifts in staff posture. They had begun to understand, to align silently with his cause. His advantage was no longer solely in knowledge, it was in the collective will of those who had been quietly observing Victor's control. "Reckless," Dominic repeated, voice rising with controlled intensity. "Or insightful. You've underestimated me, underestimated those around you, and you've allowed the truth to slip from your grasp. The control you thought absolute is cracking." Victor's composure wavered, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a brief narrowing of the eyes' small signs, but enough for Dominic to sense the first real fissures in his antagonist's armor. Then, unexpectedly, one of the staff stepped forward, a young man Dominic had noticed only in passing. His voice was steady, but carried unmistakable authority. "We've known more than he realizes," the man said, glancing briefly at Dominic before turning to Victor. "We've seen the discrepancies, the unfairness, and the hidden rules. Your time controlling this house with fear is ending." Victor's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine alarm passing through them. He masked it quickly, but the crack in his facade was undeniable. He stepped back, surveying the room with a mixture of incredulity and irritation. Clara moved beside Dominic. "This is it," she whispered. "The moment the mask begins to crumble. But stay careful. He will fight back." Dominic nodded, absorbing the electricity of the moment. The alliances had shifted, the staff had begun to choose sides, and Victor's calm, untouchable exterior had finally shown the first signs of vulnerability. And then, a bystander stepped forward, someone Dominic had dismissed as insignificant, a minor member of the household whose loyalty had always seemed ambiguous. Their voice, quiet but cutting, carried a revelation that stopped Dominic in his tracks. "I've known the truth all along," they said, eyes steady. "Not just the lies Victor told, but the real reason everything was hidden. And I can tell you who the true villain is." "Well, Victor, 3-5, the 2014 Damon, 344. Dominic's breath caught. The room seemed to hold its collective silence, all attention converging on the revelation. The name that followed was unexpected, shocking, and challenged everything Dominic had assumed. Victor's jaw tightened, his smirk gone. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The staff, Dominic, and even Clara froze, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. For the first time, the power shifted visibly. Victor, the orchestrator of fear and manipulation, was no longer untouchable. The facade that had controlled the household for decades was cracking, revealing the vulnerability beneath. Dominic felt a surge of hope and determination. The game was no longer one-sided. The alliances had shifted, partial truths had been revealed, and the antagonist's control had begun to fracture. But he also knew that the revelation of the true villain meant that the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. And as the room waited, suspended between the past and the coming truth, Dominic realized that the unmasking had only just begun and that the mansion, with all its secrets, would not release its full story without a fight. A bystander reveals they've known the truth all along and names the real villain, shocking Dominic and the staff. Victor's facade begins to crack, and the mansion's carefully maintained control begins to crumble. The story is no longer just about Dominic uncovering secrets. It's about confronting the true orchestrator behind decades of manipulation, with stakes higher than ever. The mansion's grand hall was filled with tension. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the polished floors and the assembled staff, family members, and remaining onlookers. Dominic stood at the center, Clara beside him, a quiet but steady presence anchoring him. The revelations of the previous chapters, the false leads, the manipulations, the shifting alliances had all led to this moment. Dominic's chest tightened as he surveyed the room. Victor, once untouchable, now stood at the edge of the hall, a mask of controlled fury over the cracks of his composure. The staff, emboldened by Dominic's careful guidance, had taken positions around the hall, their faces a mix of anticipation and anxiety. And the bystander, the one who had revealed the identity of the true villain, stood off to the side, calm but resolute. Dominic began, voice clear and measured. For too long, this house has been a place of secrets, manipulation, and fear. Lies were told, pieces of our history hidden, and people were used to maintain control. Today, that ends. He gestured toward the photographs and letters he had gathered, spreading them across a side table. These documents tell part of the story. The girl in the photograph, Clara, was hidden, protected from threats we are only now beginning to understand. But the story does not end there. The truth, as it turns out, is far more complicated. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Eyes across the room widened, whispers rippling among the staff. Even Victor's smirk faltered, a twitch of unease passing through his expression. Dominic turned to the bystander, who stepped forward, their voice carrying across the hall. "The true villain in this house is not who you have been led to believe," they announced, eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd. "Victor has been a manipulator, yes, but the person orchestrating the fear and secrecy for decades is someone else entirely. Their motive was not cruelty, it was protection, twisted and misapplied, but protection nonetheless." Gasps rippled through the room. Dominic felt a shiver run down his spine. The layers of deception, carefully constructed over decades, were unraveling in real time. The bystander continued, revealing evidence that Dominic had not yet pieced together: letters, financial records, and hidden correspondences showing who had truly dictated the household's rules. Every detail linked back to one person, someone Dominic had trusted, someone whose actions had been misinterpreted until now. Dominic's mind raced as he connected the dots. His mother's warnings, the hidden letters, the notes about protecting a child, all of it now fit together. The person behind it all had acted out of fear and love, not malice, carefully guiding events to safeguard those most vulnerable. Victor stepped forward, his voice sharp but defensive. "You think you understand? You're being played by shadows and whispers. You know nothing of the reasoning, the decisions, the sacrifices that kept this house functioning." Dominic turned toward him, eyes blazing. "I know more than you realize. And now, the truth is coming to light. The fear you instilled, the secrets you maintained, they are ending. The real story, the one you tried to hide, is being revealed." A hush fell over the hall as the bystander handed Dominic a bundle of previously concealed letters and documents. He opened them carefully, reading aloud passages that tied together years of manipulation, protection, and misunderstood intentions. The revelations were shocking. The antagonist had been protecting the household and its legacy, but their methods had been harsh, secretive, and often cruel in appearance. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "Everything you saw as deception, as malice, it was designed to protect. The child, the family, the household, all were at risk. And the sacrifices made were intended to prevent a far greater disaster." The room was silent, the weight of the confession sinking in. Dominic's heart pounded. He had thought he was uncovering a story of betrayal and cruelty, but the truth was layered, morally complex, and driven by love, fear, and the instinct to protect. Victor's facade cracked further, his composure failing. He tried to interject, to frame the narrative in his favor, but the evidence and testimonies presented by Dominic and the bystander were irrefutable. Every lie, every omission, every manipulation was accounted for, contextualized, and revealed for what it truly had been: an imperfect attempt to safeguard the vulnerable. Dominic's pulse slowed as the weight of understanding settled over him. The mansion, the photographs, the letters, the threats, they were all pieces of a puzzle designed not to harm, but to protect. And yet, the methods had left scars, misunderstandings, and fear in their wake. And then, the final twist, the revelation that would shake everyone present. One of the letters contained a confession, hidden for decades, the story Dominic had believed, the story the staff had witnessed, was only half the truth. There was another secret, one even deeper and more personal, that reframed the entire narrative. Dominic read the passage aloud, his voice steady despite the shock it carried. The child you protect is not the one most at risk. The true inheritance, the one the family must safeguard, lies elsewhere. Everything you see, everything you know, is a guidepost to the real truth. Gasps echoed through the hall. Clara's hand tightened slightly on Dominic's arm. Even Victor froze, his eyes betraying a flicker of genuine fear. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath. Dominic's mind raced. He realized that the story he had been chasing, the false victories, the manipulations, the threats, was only a prelude to the greater truth. The real stakes, the real dangers, and the real inheritances had yet to be fully revealed. Clara whispered, almost to herself, but loud enough for Dominic to hear, "It was never about what you thought. It was about protecting the future, and now we see the full picture." Dominic nodded, the weight of comprehension settling in. The truth, complex and morally charged, was finally emerging. The antagonists' harsh methods, the mansion's secrets, the false leads, they were all pieces of a carefully crafted protection plan. And yet, understanding this did not erase the tension, the fear, or the potential consequences. Victor's voice broke the silence, quieter now, less confident. "So, the truth is, more than I anticipated, more than anyone anticipated." Dominic turned to face him fully. "Yes, but knowing it allows us to act, not with fear, not with control, but with purpose." The room shifted, the staff's expressions softening, some nodding, others wiping tears. The revelations had cleared the air of false accusations, fear, and misunderstanding. For the first time, the mansion felt like a place where decisions could be made openly, where truths could be acknowledged without the shadow of manipulation. But even as relief began to settle, Dominic's heart skipped a beat. The final sentence in the letter lingered in his mind, a warning and a promise. Everything revealed points to the greater secret. The true challenge is yet to come. He realized that while the immediate mysteries had been unraveled, the consequences of knowing the truth and the path it required had only just begun. The full truth is revealed. The apparent antagonists' manipulations were attempts at protection, the household secrets were morally complex, and Clara's role is central. But even this revelation uncovers an even deeper secret, hinting at stakes and dangers far beyond what Dominic had imagined. The mansion, and everyone in it, must now face the implications of this hidden truth. The mansion was no longer a place of silent control. The revelation of the truth, the exposure of decades-long secrets, manipulations, and morally complex protections had shifted the balance irreversibly. The staff moved with newfound confidence, their subtle obedience replaced with quiet defiance and purpose. Dominic walked through the halls, feeling the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever. He had uncovered the truth, but now he had to navigate its consequences. Victor stood in the center of the grand hall, his usual composure fractured. He had maintained control through fear, manipulation, and secrecy for decades, and now he faced the consequences of being unmasked. Dominic's gaze met his, steady, uncompromising. Victor's smirk, once untouchable, had been replaced with a flicker of uncertainty, a recognition that the world he had built on shadows was crumbling. "You've won the information war, Dominic," Victor said quietly, almost a whisper. "But information alone does not undo the past. Do you think the house, the staff, or even the family will simply forgive what's been done?" Dominic didn't flinch. "No, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for truth and accountability. That's all." The staff, emboldened by the unmasking and the evidence laid bare, began to speak. The first voices were quiet, measured, but gradually the room filled with testimony. Accounts of subtle coercion, emotional manipulation, and intentional obfuscation flowed into the open. Victor, once in control of the narrative, now had to listen to the very people he had relied upon for silent complicity. One by one, the layers of deception were acknowledged. Each revelation painted a picture not of a simple antagonist, but of a man trapped by his own need to control, twisted by fear and the desire to protect, though his methods had caused pain and misunderstanding. Dominic listened, weighing each story, each confession. The choice before him was clear but morally complicated. vengeance or mercy. The impulse to punish Victor for decades of manipulation, for the harm caused to Clara and others, burned in him. But he also understood the truth that had been revealed. Much of the harm had been unintended, a byproduct of desperate protection. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm and firm. "Dominic," she said, "he was wrong. But he was also trying to shield us all from a greater danger. Justice doesn't always mean revenge. Sometimes it means understanding, and making sure the past doesn't repeat itself." Dominic's jaw tightened as he considered her words. The mansion had been a stage for decades of secrets, but now it could become a place of renewal. The question was how to balance accountability with mercy, punishment with redemption. Victor broke the silence, his voice steady now but edged with humility. "I failed in many ways," he admitted. "I controlled, I lied, I manipulated, but always with the intent of protecting. I accept whatever consequences come, and I ask only that my actions be understood in context." The room was silent. Dominic studied him, weighing the honesty in his confession against the suffering caused by his methods. The staff waited, anticipating his decision. Clara's hand brushed lightly against Dominic's arm, a reminder that the choice he made would affect more than just Victor, it would define the future of the mansion and everyone within it. After a long pause, Dominic spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Victor, your methods caused harm, yes, but your intentions were not wholly cruel. The truth has been revealed, and accountability will be upheld, but vengeance is not the path forward. You will step down from control of the household, and all decisions will be transparent from this point on. You will assist in repairing the damage, not to save yourself, but to protect those who were affected." Victor's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering, but he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "And I accept it." A collective sigh seemed to pass through the staff. The tension that had gripped the mansion for decades began to lift. The shift from fear to transparency, from secrecy to accountability, marked a new chapter for everyone in the household. Dominic turned his attention to Clara. She had been at the center of the mystery, the unintended pawn of decades of secrecy. Her presence had guided him, warned him, and ultimately anchored him to the truth. Now, he could offer her not just clarity, but recognition and protection. "You were right," he said quietly. "I was looking at everything wrong. But together, we've set it straight. You are safe, and the mansion can finally be a place where your role is recognized, not hidden." Clara's eyes softened, and she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "It's been a long road," she said. "But the truth finally matters more than fear." The day continued with careful reconciliation. Staff members shared experiences, some apologizing for their complicity, others relieved to have the truth finally acknowledged. The mansion, a symbol of power, secrecy, and control, was becoming a place of understanding, transparency, and cautious optimism. Yet Dominic knew that even as the immediate reckoning passed, the consequences of decades of secrecy could not be erased. Relationships would need rebuilding, trust would need to be earned, and the legacy of fear would linger in subtle ways. He also knew that the final layer of the secret, the one hinted at in the previous revelations, remained. The deeper truths, the long-term implications, and the real stakes for the future had yet to fully unfold. And then it happened. As the group dispersed, a servant approached Dominic quietly, handing him a small envelope with no return address. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single note, written in the same delicate hand as his mother's letters. "You have chosen wisely. But the final challenge approaches. Be prepared, Dominic. The future depends on your next steps." Dominic felt a chill run down his spine. The immediate reckoning had concluded, but the warning was unmistakable. The story, the mystery, and the consequences were far from over. The mansion had revealed its secrets, but it had also revealed a deeper challenge, one that would demand all of Dominic's courage, insight, and moral clarity. Clara appeared beside him, her expression serious. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "The truth brought us here, but the future, that's what we must protect now. And it will not be easy." Dominic nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon him. He had navigated deception, fear, and moral complexity, and now he faced the ultimate decision: how to act in a world where the line between protection and harm, justice and mercy, was as fine as a whisper. He looked around the hall, at the staff, at Clara, and at the mansion itself. The legacy of secrecy had ended, but the legacy of action was just beginning. Dominic has restored accountability and chosen mercy over vengeance, but a new warning arrives. The final challenge is approaching, and the future of the mansion, its people, and the legacy of secrecy depends on his next moves. Even after the reckoning, the stakes are higher than ever. The mansion was quieter now, but in a different way. The oppressive tension that had hung over its walls for decades had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. The staff moved with purpose rather than fear, carrying out their duties with a new sense of agency. The grand halls, once echoing with whispers of control and secrets, now carried a calm, steady rhythm. Dominic walked through the corridors, Clara at his side. The weight of the past months, the revelations, the confrontations, and the reckoning still pressed against him, but it was a different kind of weight, one that demanded responsibility rather than inducing dread. Victor, once the house's invisible hand of manipulation, had retreated from authority. He still lingered, quiet and reflective, participating in the restoration and transparency of the household. Dominic had not demanded punishment, only accountability, and in doing so, he had allowed Victor to exist within the new order, an imperfect man, now compelled to act with integrity. The staff had begun to reorganize the household, assigning roles with fairness, ensuring that no one was forced into blind obedience again. Clara, who had been hidden and protected for so long, now walked freely through the halls, her presence acknowledged and respected. Her role was no longer that of a secret ward or a silent observer, she was an integral part of the household's future. Dominic paused in the library, looking out the tall windows at the garden below. The sunlight filtered through, illuminating the manicured lawns and the quiet fountains. It felt peaceful, but he knew that peace had been hard-won, and that vigilance would always be necessary. He had learned that truth was not a single revelation but a continual process of understanding, compassion, and courage. Clara joined him silently, her hand brushing against his. "It feels different now," she said softly. "Like the house itself is breathing easier." Dominic nodded. "It is. And it will continue to change, grow, and heal. But that depends on us, the people who inhabit it, the choices we make, the truths we acknowledge." He thought of the countless twists, the missteps, the near failures. He thought of the letters, the photographs, the hidden compartments, and the revelations that had reshaped his understanding of family, loyalty, and protection. He had been angry, frustrated, and humiliated, but he had also learned the value of patience, observation, and moral discernment. Clara's gaze was steady, her presence a reminder of the people he was now protecting, not just from external threats, but from the legacy of misunderstanding and fear. "We've come a long way," she said, "but there's still work to do." Dominic smiled faintly. "Yes. But for the first time, we're moving forward with clarity, not shadows." Outside, the staff were tending to the gardens, organizing the kitchens, and beginning to restore a sense of normalcy that had been absent for far too long. Conversations were open and candid, a stark contrast to the whispered directives of the past. The mansion, once a symbol of secrecy and control, was becoming a home in the truest sense, a place where people's roles were acknowledged, their voices respected, and their contributions valued. Dominic reflected on the lessons of the past months. The mansion had tested him, exposing his assumptions, forcing him to confront both moral ambiguity and personal weakness. He had discovered that justice and truth were not always aligned with punishment, that protection could look cruel, and that understanding required both patience and courage. Victor approached quietly, standing a few feet away. His posture was humble, reflective, and Dominic recognized a man transformed not entirely, but enough to accept accountability and participate in the new order. "Thank you," Victor said quietly, "for allowing me to continue, even after everything." Dominic nodded. "Redemption is not a gift, Victor. It's a choice. And now, it's your choice how to act, moving forward." Victor's gaze softened, a hint of remorse and understanding in his eyes. "I understand. And I will do what I can to rebuild, to guide rather than control." Dominic felt a subtle relief. The mansion's healing depended not just on revealing the truth, but on how everyone would respond to it. The reckoning had been necessary, but it had also set the stage for a future where integrity, transparency, and moral responsibility could thrive. Clara and Dominic moved through the halls together, observing the staff engaged in their work, sharing quiet conversations, and occasionally smiling at each other. There was no illusion that all scars had healed or that the past could be erased, but there was a recognition that the future could be different, brighter, safer, and guided by understanding rather than fear. Dominic paused at the front of the mansion, looking outward at the distant horizon. The sunlight reflected off the windows, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the gardens shimmered with a quiet energy of renewal. He felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also the power of knowledge, courage, and moral choice. He turned to Clara. We've learned that truth is complex, that protection can be harsh, and that love sometimes hides in shadows. But we've also learned that transparency, honesty, and courage can restore what fear once controlled. Clara nodded, her expression serene but resolute. And now, we shape the legacy, not the past. Dominic's gaze swept the mansion, the staff, and the gardens once more. He understood that life would not be perfect, that the scars of deception and fear would linger, and that challenges would continue to arise. But he also understood that the mansion was no longer a prison, no longer a stage for manipulation. It was a home and a place of truth, guided by the choices of those willing to act with integrity. He felt a sense of completion, tempered by awareness. The journey had been arduous, filled with twists, reversals, and moral complexity, but it had led to a new normal, one shaped, not by fear or secrecy, but by understanding and responsibility. Dominic took a deep breath, the air in the grand hall calm and steady. He felt Clara's hand brush against his again, a quiet affirmation of shared purpose and trust. The mansion, its inhabitants, and its legacy would endure not because the past had been erased, but because it had been confronted, understood, and integrated into the present. As he stood there, looking out over the gardens and the quiet horizon, Dominic allowed himself a final reflection. Truth is not always what we expect. Protection can look like cruelty, and the hardest battles often lead to the most enduring peace. In the end, the courage to understand, forgive, and act shapes the legacy we leave behind. The mansion was alive with quiet energy. The past had been revealed, the reckoning had been faced, and a new normal had begun, fragile, imperfect, but real. In the end, it was not secrets or fear that defined the house but the courage to face the truth, and the choice to let understanding shape the future.